there was a knock at my front door. Not a hurried knock, not the sort that startles you from your chair. Just 3 slow taps, as though whoever stood outside wasn't entirely sure they should be there. I remember lifting my eyes from the little blue teapot that sat on the stove. The water had only just begun to sing, and the scent of dried chamomile was already filling my kitchen. Outside, the October rain drifted gently across the windows, turning the world beyond the glass into nothing more than moving shadows. Even now, more than 70 years later, I can still hear that knock more clearly than I can remember some birthdays. Funny, isn't it, how the smallest sounds sometimes stay with us the longest? Before we settle into tonight's memory, if evenings like this bring you a little peace, I'd be honored if you returned to sit beside my lamp again. There's always another quiet story waiting here for you. I had been living alone on that little farmhouse for nearly a year, not because I wanted to. Life simply has a way of rearranging itself when you're young, often before you've had time to understand what has changed. My parents had moved closer to my older sister after father's health began to fade, and I had stayed behind to look after the property until it could be sold. It wasn't much of a place, just 2 bedrooms, a crooked porch, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of pinewood smoke, no matter how much I cleaned. But I loved it, especially on rainy evenings. The fireplace made the walls seem warmer than they really were, and every creak in the floorboards felt like the house reminding me it was still awake. That night was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had disappeared long before sunset. Only the rain remained, steady, patient, almost comforting. The knock came again, 3 gentle taps. I dried my hands on my apron and walked toward the front door. The old oak floor sighed beneath every step. When I reached the frosted glass beside the door, I could make out only a shape. Tall, still, motionless, the sort of silhouette that tells you almost nothing. For just a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't heard it. Young women living alone learned to be careful, especially in those days. We didn't have telephones in every pocket. We couldn't simply ask for help in seconds. Sometimes caution was the only companion you had after dark. I rested my hand on the latch, then stopped. Why do I still remember that hesitation? Perhaps because every life is quietly shaped by moments no longer than a single breath. Had I waited another minute, had I ignored the knock, everything that followed might have belonged to someone else's memory instead of mine. I opened the door only a few inches. Cold air slipped inside first. Then came the smell of wet earth and rain-soaked leaves. Standing beneath the porch roof was a young man. No older than 28, I would guess now, though at the time he simply looked tired, not dangerous, not frightening, just exhausted. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his dark felt hat. His wool coat clung heavily to his shoulders, soaked through from the storm. Mud covered his boots nearly to the ankles, and tiny beads of rain shimmered on the leather satchel hanging across his chest. He removed his hat immediately. "Good evening, ma'am," he said quietly. His voice surprised me, gentle, almost embarrassed. "I hate to trouble you. There's something I've learned after 95 years. People often remember words. I remember voices. Some voices settle into your memory because they carry joy. Others because they carry sorrow. His carried something else. Weariness. The kind that sleep alone cannot cure. I've been walking since this afternoon," he continued. "The rain caught me farther south than I expected." He glanced back toward the road before looking at me again. I wondered if, perhaps, I might warm myself for just a little while. No demand, no pleading, only a quiet question. I looked beyond him. The road stretched empty in both directions. No passing cars, no neighbors. Only rain dancing across the gravel like tiny silver threads beneath the fading light. He seemed alone, entirely alone. "Have you eaten?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "Not today." Those 3 words settled heavily between us. I knew what hunger looked like. Everyone of my generation did. The Great Depression had taught us that an empty stomach leaves a certain softness in the eyes. Not weakness, just exhaustion. His eyes had that same look. Without thinking much longer, I opened the door wider. "You'd better come inside before you catch your death." He smiled, not broadly, just enough for the corners of his mouth to lift for a heartbeat. "Thank you, even now." That tiny smile is easier for me to remember than the photograph I would see 3 days later. He stepped carefully onto the old wooden floor, almost apologizing with every footstep. "I'll try not to make a mess." "Nonsense," I said. "The floor has survived worse than a little rain." He chuckled softly. Only once. It was a warm sound, ordinary, the sort of laugh you forget almost immediately. Or at least, you think you will. I handed him one of Father's old towels. He thanked me twice before drying his hair. Then he carefully placed his leather satchel on the floor beside the chair. Not carelessly, not absent-mindedly, deliberately, almost as though it never left his sight. At the time, I barely noticed. Today, I wonder why I didn't. The kettle finally began to whistle, a cheerful sound, bright against the rain. "I was just making tea," I said. "Chamomile. I haven't had chamomile in years." Years. Such a curious answer. Most people would have said they liked it, or that they didn't. Instead, he spoke as though remembering another life. Before I could ask what he meant, his eyes drifted toward the kitchen window. Not casually, carefully, watching, listening, waiting for what? I couldn't have guessed then. And perhaps neither could he. The rain continued to fall. The fire burned a little brighter. And somewhere beyond the darkness, someone else's story was already moving quietly toward mine. The kettle sang until I lifted it from the stove. For a moment, the little kitchen felt wonderfully ordinary again. Steam curled toward the ceiling, carrying the sweet scent of chamomile through the room. Outside, the rain continued its quiet conversation with the porch roof, never rushing, never stopping. Those sounds have faded over the years, but not that evening. Never that evening. The young man stood beside the chair, still holding Father's old towel. "I don't want to drip water all over your floor," he said with an awkward smile. "You've already worried more about my floor than I have," I replied. That made him laugh, just a little. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It sounded like someone remembering how to laugh after a very long time. He carefully removed his heavy coat and folded it across the back of the chair instead of simply dropping it there. It struck me as unusually thoughtful. Many travelers in those days were too tired to bother with such things. His clothes beneath were plain. A faded white shirt, dark suspenders, trousers that had clearly been repaired more than once. Nothing expensive, nothing remarkable. If I had passed him on a busy street, I doubt I would have looked twice. Sometimes, the people who become unforgettable first appear completely ordinary. I poured tea into 2 mismatched cups, one blue, one cream-colored. He accepted the cream-colored cup with both hands. "Thank you." Not everyone says those words the same way. Some people offer thanks because they're expected to, others because they truly mean them. His gratitude seemed genuine, quiet, almost humble. I sliced the last of the fresh bread I'd baked that morning. There was also a small pot of vegetable soup left from supper. Nothing fancy. Carrots, potatoes, a little onion, just enough herbs to make the kitchen smell welcoming. "I'm afraid it isn't much," I said. He looked at the table before answering. "It looks better than anything I've seen in days." Again, an unusual choice of words. Not weeks, not months, days. I wondered where he'd come from. But in those years, people were always traveling. Some looking for work, some visiting family, some simply searching for a place where tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. It didn't seem polite to ask too many questions. For a while, we simply ate. The only sounds were spoons against bowls, the fire settling into glowing embers, and rain tapping softly against the windows. There is something peaceful about sharing silence with another person. You learn almost as much as you do through conversation. He ate slowly, not like someone starving, more like someone determined not to appear hungry. Every few bites, his eyes drifted toward the front window, not nervously, carefully, watching the empty road disappear into the darkness. I followed his gaze once. Nothing, only rain, only wind, only the lonely stretch of gravel leading toward town. Still, he kept looking. "I hope you're not expecting someone," I asked gently. He blinked, almost surprised by the question. "No," a pause. "Just making sure I haven't brought trouble with me." He seemed to realize how strange that sounded. "I mean," he added with a small smile, I've walked through enough storms to know they sometimes bring fallen trees onto the road. I nodded. It was a reasonable explanation. At least, it sounded reasonable then. Looking back after so many years, memory has a way of adding shadows where none seemed to exist. But memory can also be unfair. I've often wondered whether I noticed those little moments because they truly mattered, or because later events taught my mind to search for them. I'm still not certain. The fire crackled softly. I reached for the basket of apples resting near the window. There, from the tree behind the house, he accepted one with a grateful nod. My mother used to bake apple pies. It was the first time he'd mentioned family. What was she like? I asked. For several seconds, he simply looked at the apple in his hands. Kind. Only one word. Then silence. Not the comfortable kind we'd shared earlier. This silence carried something heavier, as though the memory itself had become difficult to hold. I decided not to press him. Some stories arrive only when they're ready. Others remain locked away forever. A gust of wind rattled the windows. The old farmhouse answered with its familiar creaks. He looked toward the sound. You've lived here long. Since I was a little girl. He smiled again. I imagine these walls have heard a great many stories. Oh, they certainly have. I glanced around the kitchen. My father used to say old houses remember everything. He looked into the fire. I hope they also know when to keep a secret. Those words, at the time, they sounded almost poetic. The sort of thing a tired traveler might say after walking alone all day. Years later, I would hear them very differently. We finished our tea. I gathered the bowls and carried them to the sink. Behind me, he stood and quietly folded the towel I'd loaned him. Not tossed, not crumpled, folded neatly into a square. Such a small act, yet somehow, that's one of the clearest memories I still have. Funny, isn't it? The mind often preserves tiny kindnesses while letting entire years fade away. As I washed the dishes, I noticed something reflected in the kitchen window. Not outside, inside. The young man had gently picked up a framed photograph resting on the shelf. It was an old picture of my parents standing beside the farmhouse years before. He studied it for only a moment before carefully placing it back exactly where he'd found it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have touched it. That's quite all right. They look happy." They were, he nodded. I hope they knew it. His voice was almost a whisper, as though he wasn't speaking only about my parents, as though, perhaps, he was thinking of someone else entirely. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8 slow chimes. He looked toward the sound. "I've already taken more of your evening than I intended. You don't have to leave while it's still raining." He hesitated, then glanced once more through the darkened window. This time, he wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at the sky. "I'd be grateful," he said softly, "if I could stay until the rain eases." Of course. I added another log to the fire. Neither of us knew then. that by sunrise he would ask me for one more favor, a favor so ordinary that I agreed without a second thought. Sometime during the night, the rain finally grew tired, not all at once. It simply became softer, until it sounded less like rain and more like someone gently brushing their fingertips across the roof. I have always loved that moment. The world seems to exhale. Even now, at 95, I sometimes wake before dawn just to listen for that silence after a storm. It reminds me that nothing, not even heavy weather, lasts forever. The young man had fallen asleep in Father's old rocking chair. Not deeply. Every now and then he shifted, as though his dreams refused to let him rest. The fire cast a warm orange glow across the room, making long shadows dance on the walls. His satchel still rested beside the chair, exactly where he had placed it. He never let it leave his reach. I noticed that again. Still, I thought little of it. Travelers often carried everything they owned in a single bag. There was nothing unusual about wanting to keep it close, or so I believed. I covered him with an old wool blanket before quietly climbing the stairs to my room. Sleep came slowly, not because I felt afraid. Quite the opposite. I remember thinking how fortunate it was that he had found shelter before the storm grew worse. Isn't it strange how differently we remember our own thoughts once we know the ending? Sometimes I wish I could return to that younger version of myself, not to warn her, just to sit beside her for a moment, to let her enjoy the peace she still believed the world held. Morning arrived, wrapped in silver mist. Before the sun itself appeared, pale light crept through the curtains, turning every raindrop outside into tiny pieces of glass. The farmhouse felt unusually still. Only the old clock downstairs marked the passing minutes. Tick, tick, tick. I dressed quietly and made my way to the kitchen. The smell of damp earth drifted through the cracked window. The storm had washed everything clean. The maple trees sparkled. The fields beyond the house shimmered beneath a blanket of fog. For a few beautiful moments, it looked as though the whole world had been made new. He was already awake, standing on the porch, hat in his hands, watching the sunrise. I opened the screen door. "You've been up a while." I couldn't sleep much after dawn. He smiled politely. "It's too beautiful a morning to waste indoors." His words carried no excitement, only appreciation, like a man who had learned not to expect many beautiful mornings. I poured fresh coffee. He accepted only half a cup. "I shouldn't take too much." "Nonsense," I laughed. "I've plenty." He shook his head gently. My mother used to tell me never to leave someone with less because I arrived. Again, his mother. Only little pieces, never the whole picture. It made me wonder about her. Was she waiting for him somewhere? Did she know where he was? Or had life scattered their family the way storms scatter leaves across a field? I almost asked. Instead, I buttered another slice of bread. We ate breakfast mostly in silence, comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who expect never to meet again. I think that's why strangers sometimes tell us more than friends do. There is freedom in believing someone will remain only a memory. As he stood to leave, he reached into his coat pocket. "I'd like to pay you." He unfolded a few worn bills. I pushed his hand away with a smile. "You'll insult me if you do." "I couldn't. You already have." He looked genuinely embarrassed. "I can't accept all this kindness for nothing. My father always said kindness isn't something you sell." For the first time, his eyes became slightly wet. Not with tears exactly. More like someone trying very hard not to let old emotions surface. I wish more people believed that. He placed the money back into his pocket. Then he looked toward the road. "I hate to ask another favor." "What is it?" "I'm trying to reach Ashford." The small town lay nearly 20 miles north. "I was hoping to catch the morning bus," he explained. "But I learned yesterday it no longer stops near the crossroads." He looked almost apologetic. "If you're heading that way, even part of the distance would help." I wasn't planning to go. At least, not until that moment. Then I remembered I needed flour, lamp oil, and thread from the general store. I suppose I could use a few supplies. His shoulders relaxed. I'd be grateful. It took us only a few minutes to prepare. I packed a basket for town, locked the farmhouse door, checked that the fire was safely out. The old pickup truck waited beside the barn, still covered with tiny drops of rain. Father had taught me to drive it years earlier. It rattled. It groaned. Sometimes it protested every gear, but it never failed to start. Not once. I climbed behind the wheel. He settled quietly into the passenger seat, placing the leather satchel carefully at his feet. Again, within easy reach. The engine coughed twice before coming to life. We rolled slowly down the muddy lane, leaving fresh tracks through the wet earth. The countryside stretched peacefully around us. Golden fields, stone fences, rows of maple trees glowing with autumn color. The world felt gentle, unhurried, beautiful after the storm. For several miles, neither of us spoke. The windshield wipers swept back and forth with steady rhythm. Swish, swish, swish. Sometimes silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's simply two people allowing the road to do the talking. Finally, he pointed toward a flock of geese crossing the pale morning sky. They always know where they're going. They seem to. I've envied them. I glanced at him. "You've done much traveling." "A little more than I expected." His answer carried the same careful distance as before. Never dishonest, yet never complete. The road curved through a stretch of pine forest where the morning mist still lingered between the trees. The sunlight hadn't yet reached the ground. Everything felt hushed, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, without warning, he leaned forward in his seat. "Would you mind stopping up ahead? There isn't a town for several more miles." I know. He looked toward a narrow dirt road disappearing into the trees. This is where I need to go. I slowed the truck. There was nothing there that I could see. No farmhouse, no church, no gas station. Only the quiet road winding into the forest. For the first time since we'd met, a small question stirred inside me. Not fear, just curiosity. Why would anyone leave the main road for a place that seemed to lead nowhere? I pulled gently onto the shoulder. The truck came to a stop. The engine idled softly, and neither of us spoke for several long seconds. For a little while, neither of us moved. The truck rested quietly on the side of the narrow country road, its engine humming beneath us like a sleepy old cat. Ahead, the dirt path disappeared into the pines. No signposts, no houses, no smoke rising from a chimney. Only trees standing patiently in the cool morning air. I remember looking at the road, then at him, then back at the road again. It seemed an unusual place to end a journey, but life has taught me something over 95 years. Not every destination makes sense to the person watching someone leave. He reached for the leather satchel resting at his feet. He lifted it carefully, brushing away a few drops of dried mud with the sleeve of his coat. "Thank you," he said, not quickly, not casually. The words carried weight, as though he understood I had given him more than a ride. Perhaps, for one quiet evening, I had reminded him what it felt like to be treated as an ordinary human being. I smiled. "I hope you find what you're looking for just a heartbeat." He looked as though he wanted to answer honestly. His lips parted, then closed again. Instead, he simply nodded. "So do I." He climbed out of the truck. The morning air smelled of damp pine needles and fresh earth. Before closing the passenger door, he leaned back toward the open window. "If you ever wonder about today," he paused, "remember that your kindness mattered." Then he tipped his hat, closed the door gently, and walked toward the trees, not hurriedly, not nervously, just steadily. Within half a minute, the forest had quietly swallowed him. I waited another minute, expecting him to reappear. He never did. There are moments in life that seem completely ordinary while they're happening. Only later do they gather meaning. At the time, I simply shifted the truck into gear and continued toward Ashford. The general store needed flour. The oil lamp at home was nearly empty, and winter was only a few weeks away. My thoughts returned to simple things: bread, firewood, whether the hens would keep laying through the colder months. By the time I reached town, the young traveler had already begun fading into memory. Or so I believed. Ashford was busier than usual that Tuesday. Farmers loaded wagons outside the grain mill. Children hurried toward the little brick schoolhouse, carrying books beneath their arms. Mrs. Donnelly waved from the bakery window while arranging fresh loaves behind the glass. Everything felt reassuringly familiar. The kind of morning that makes you believe nothing remarkable could possibly happen. I parked the truck beside the general store. Inside, the familiar bell above the door gave its cheerful little ring. "Morning, Eleanor," old Mr. Harris called from behind the counter. "Morning. Roads clear after the storm. Muddy, aren't they always?" We both laughed. I wandered slowly through the narrow aisles. Flour, sugar, lamp oil, thread, a tin of coffee. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. Funny how ordinary errands continue even while life quietly prepares to surprise us. As Mr. Harris wrapped my purchases in brown paper, the front door opened again. Sheriff Collins stepped inside. He removed his hat politely. "Morning, folks." Everyone knew Sheriff Collins. He had the sort of calm voice that could settle a room without ever becoming loud. He exchanged a few friendly words with Mr. Harris before unfolding the morning newspaper resting near the register. The headlines stretched across nearly half the front page. I barely glanced at it. Politics rarely interested me. Instead, I carried my parcels outside and loaded them into the truck. The newspaper remained behind, and with it, a story that hadn't yet reached me. 3 days passed. Quiet days. Peaceful ones. I mended Father's old fishing jacket, cleaned the windows before winter, baked another loaf of bread, raked damp leaves beneath the maple tree. Life returned to its comfortable rhythm. Every now and then, I remembered the traveler. Mostly, I wondered whether he'd reached wherever he had hoped to go. I imagined him finding work, perhaps visiting family, perhaps beginning again somewhere new. It pleased me to think so. Sometimes we create hopeful endings for strangers simply because our hearts prefer them. Friday morning arrived bright and clear. No rain, only crisp autumn sunshine. After breakfast, I walked down the lane to collect my newspaper from the mailbox. The paper felt cool beneath my arm as I carried it back inside. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat beside the kitchen window, and unfolded the pages. The smell of fresh ink filled the room. Even now, that scent brings back the memory. Strange, isn't it? A single smell can unlock a door in the mind that has remained closed for decades. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Local harvest news, advertisements, church announcements, a photograph from the county fair. Then I turned another page, and everything inside me became still. There, near the center of the page, was a photograph, small, grainy, black and white, yet unmistakable. The young traveler, the man who had shared my table, the man who had thanked me for tea, the man who had folded Father's towel so carefully. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The coffee in my hands grew cold. The ticking clock seemed suddenly louder than it had ever been before. Tick, tick, tick. I read the article once, then again, then a third time. Authorities had arrested a man connected to the death of a traveling salesman whose disappearance had been reported days earlier. Investigators believed He had been moving through several nearby counties under different names before finally being recognized and taken into custody. The article didn't tell the whole story. Newspapers rarely do. It offered facts, dates, places, questions still waiting for answers. But one fact was painfully clear. The photograph belonged to the same quiet stranger who had sat in my kitchen only days before. I laid the newspaper flat upon the table. My eyes drifted toward the empty chair across from me. The very chair where he'd warmed himself by the fire. I could almost hear his voice again. Your kindness mattered. At that moment, I no longer knew what those words meant. I didn't finish my coffee that morning. It remained on the table until it had gone completely cold. The newspaper lay open beside it. I must have read the article a dozen times, hoping the photograph would somehow become someone else. It never did. The face remained the same thoughtful eyes, the same tired expression, the same young man who had thanked me for bread and wished me well before disappearing into the pine forest. For a long while, I simply sat there, not frightened, not angry, only confused. There is a peculiar feeling that arrives when two truths refuse to fit together. The man I remembered, and the man described in the newspaper. They seemed like strangers to one another, yet they were, somehow, the very same person. The clock in the hallway continued its patient rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. I remember staring into the fire, listening to the wood settle with quiet little pops. The room hadn't changed. The rain outside hadn't changed. Even the blue teacup from 3 nights earlier still rested on the drying rack beside the sink. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Only I had changed. That is how life often works. Sometimes the world stays perfectly still, while our understanding of it shifts forever. Without thinking, I stood and walked toward the rocking chair. Father's old chair, the one where the traveler had spent the night. I rested my hand on its worn wooden arm. It felt warm in my memory, though it had long since cooled. I tried to picture him exactly as he had been. His careful smile, his quiet laugh, the way he had folded the towel before leaving. Little details surfaced one after another, not because they had seemed important then, but because my mind suddenly wanted every answer it had failed to ask. Did his hands tremble? Had his coat been torn? Was there mud on one sleeve or both? Did he seem worried? Or merely tired? Memory can become a strange detective. It searches every corner, examines every shadow, convinced that one forgotten detail will suddenly explain everything. But memories rarely work that way. They offer fragments, not certainty. I walked to the kitchen window. The rain had begun again. Very softly, almost politely, drops slid down the glass, blurring the maple tree outside into patches of gold and gray. I remembered how he had watched that same window while eating his supper, again and again. At the time, I had assumed he was watching the weather. Now, I wondered whether he had been listening for something else. A passing car, footsteps, someone searching, or perhaps nothing at all. It is dangerous to let hindsight rewrite every ordinary moment. When we already know an ending, our minds become eager to plant clues that were never truly there. I've spent many years reminding myself of that, because fairness matters, especially when remembering another human being. By afternoon, I had convinced myself of one thing. I needed to speak with Sheriff Collins. Not because anyone had accused me of doing something wrong. No one even knew the traveler had stopped at my farmhouse. But silence can grow surprisingly heavy. Sometimes speaking aloud is the only way to set down a burden you've been carrying alone. I put on my coat, wrapped Mother's knitted scarf around my neck, and drove back toward Ashford. The roads were drying beneath a pale autumn sun. Leaves drifted lazily across the fields. The countryside looked peaceful, almost unchanged. It amazed me that beauty could continue so calmly, while questions echoed inside a person's heart. The sheriff's office sat beside the courthouse, a modest brick building with white painted steps, and 2 maple trees standing guard out front. I parked the truck and remained seated for a moment. My hands rested quietly on the steering wheel. I remember wondering, would he think I'd been foolish? Would he ask why I'd opened my door to a stranger? Would he tell me I should have known better? Those thoughts felt heavier than the walk from the truck to the front steps. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Deputy Miller looked up from his desk. "Afternoon, Miss Eleanor." "Good afternoon." "Sheriff's in his office." He smiled kindly. "You can go right in." The ordinary warmth of his greeting settled my nerves more than he probably realized. Sheriff Collins stood as I entered. "Eleanor." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "What brings you by?" I sat carefully, smoothing my skirt with nervous hands. For a second, words refused to come. Then I reached into my handbag and unfolded the newspaper clipping I'd brought with me. I paused. "I think this man spent the night at my house." The sheriff looked down at the photograph, then back at me. His expression didn't harden. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he quietly folded his hands. I wondered if someone around here might recognize him. There was no accusation in his voice, only calm attention. That mattered more than I can explain. For the next several minutes, I told him everything. The knock at the door, the tea, the soup, the ride, the place where he'd asked to be let out near the Pine Road. I described every detail I could honestly remember. When I finished, the room became very quiet. Sheriff Collins nodded slowly. "You've helped us more than you know." His words should have brought relief. Instead, another question rose inside me. One I had been carrying ever since seeing the newspaper. I keep wondering. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Should I have seen something? He leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, very gently, he said, "Eleanor, you met a tired traveler on a rainy night. You responded with kindness. Nothing you've told me suggests you ignored danger. You simply acted according to the person you are." Those words stayed with me. But even kind reassurance cannot silence every doubt overnight. Some questions don't disappear because someone answers them. They soften, little by little, across the years. Sheriff Collins reached for a folded map on his desk. He traced one finger along the narrow country roads. Then he stopped at the place where I'd left the traveler. "There is one thing," he said quietly. I looked up. "The path you described." He paused, studying the map. Wasn't leading where most people would have expected. The room fell silent once more, and before he explained why, I felt my heart grow unexpectedly still. Sheriff Collins left his finger resting on the map. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The old ceiling fan turned lazily above our heads, pushing warm autumn air around the room with a soft, steady rhythm. Outside, I could hear a wagon rolling past the courthouse. Its wooden wheels creaked over the road. Life continued. People laughed somewhere beyond the open window. A dog barked once in the distance. Everything sounded wonderfully ordinary. Yet inside that little office, the world felt unusually small. Finally, the sheriff looked up. "That dirt road doesn't lead into town," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "I thought perhaps there was a farmhouse hidden back there." He gently shook his head. "There used to be one, years ago. It burned down before the war." He folded the map closed. "Now the road ends near an old logging trail." I pictured the morning again. The mist hanging between the pine trees. The young traveler lifting his satchel, walking without hesitation, as though he already knew exactly where he was going. At the time, I had assumed he did. Now I realized I had never truly wondered. Sheriff Collins noticed the expression on my face. "Don't blame yourself for that." I wasn't. I stopped. The truth was, perhaps I was. Not because I believed I had done something wrong, but because the mind has a curious habit of believing that, if only we had noticed one more detail, one more glance, one more question, everything might have unfolded differently. Age has taught me that this is rarely true. We imagine certainty only after the story is finished. While we're living it, we're simply taking the next step we believe is right. The sheriff reached for a small notebook lying on his desk. "There is something else I'd like you to know." He spoke carefully, not as an officer delivering facts, but as one human being trying to ease another's burden. When he was taken into custody, the sheriff paused. He didn't resist. I looked up. He answered our questions politely. He never tried to run. He asked that the people who had unknowingly shown him kindness not be troubled. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" He mentioned an elderly couple who had given him directions. a shopkeeper who had shared a meal, and the sheriff glanced at his notebook. A young woman at a farmhouse who offered him shelter from the rain. The room became very still. "He never gave your name," the sheriff continued. "He only said," again he paused, "she deserved the truth, but she had no way of knowing it." Those words settled quietly inside me, not because they answered anything. They didn't. If anything, they left me with even more questions. I wondered whether he had regretted the choices that had brought him there. I wondered whether, during that rainy evening in my kitchen, he had wanted to speak honestly, but couldn't. Or perhaps I was simply searching for kindness, because kindness is easier for the heart to carry than hatred. I've never known the answer, and perhaps I never will. Sheriff Collins leaned forward. "Eleanor, I need you to hear one thing very clearly." I nodded. "You are not responsible for another person's decisions. You offered shelter during a storm. You shared a meal. You treated someone with dignity. Those actions remain good. They do not become bad because you later learned something painful." I lowered my eyes. His words were gentle, wise, yet forgiveness, especially forgiveness of ourselves, often arrives much more slowly than advice. The sheriff stood and walked toward the window. For a while, we simply watched the courthouse square. Children were chasing one another beneath the maple trees. A woman carried fresh flowers from the market. Two elderly men sat on a bench, discussing the weather as though it were the most important subject in the world. Sheriff Collins smiled faintly. "Look out there." I did. Every one of those people is carrying a story no one else can see. He wasn't speaking only about the traveler. He was speaking about all of us, about hidden grief, private hopes, mistakes, regrets, acts of courage no newspaper would ever print. That thought stayed with me far longer than the newspaper article itself. Before I left, the sheriff walked me to the front door. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. Golden light spilled across the courthouse steps. It was one of those beautiful autumn days that almost convince you the world is simpler than it truly is. "Eleanor," I turned back, "if this memory ever becomes too heavy," he smiled kindly, "don't carry it alone." I won't. Though, if I'm honest, for many years, I did. Not because anyone expected me to, because I expected it of myself. I drove home slowly that afternoon, past the grain mill, past Mrs. Donnelly's bakery, past the little schoolhouse where children were laughing during recess. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet, I noticed people differently. The tired farmer walking beside his wagon, the young mother comforting a crying child, the elderly gentleman reading quietly on his porch. I found myself wondering, what joys had they known? What sorrows? What burdens were hidden behind ordinary smiles? It was the first time I truly understood how little we can know about another person's life from a passing glance. And strangely, that realization didn't make me more fearful. It made me more patient. As the farmhouse came into view, The evening light caught the windows just right. For a brief moment, the glass reflected the sunset so brightly that it looked as though a lamp had already been lit inside. I smiled. Home. The place where this memory had begun. The place where I would eventually discover it would quietly return every autumn for the rest of my life. Life has a quiet way of asking us to keep moving, even when our hearts would rather remain standing in yesterday. The weeks became months. The months slowly became years. Winter arrived with its familiar blankets of snow. Spring returned with robins building nests beneath the porch roof. The maple tree outside my kitchen window shed its leaves, then grew them again, over and over. The seasons never seemed to question where they were going. People, however, often do. By the following summer, my parents had finally sold the farmhouse. I packed my belongings one careful box at a time. Father's books, Mother's sewing basket, the little blue teapot that had been on the stove the evening the traveler knocked at my door. I wrapped each piece in newspaper. When I reached the old rocking chair, I paused. It still sat beside the fireplace, exactly where it had always been, exactly where he had spent that rainy night. I rested my hand on its smooth wooden arm. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, not to the chair, to the house. Old homes carry our laughter, our worries, our quiet conversations with ourselves. When we leave them, a part of us always remains behind. I married Thomas the following year. He was a patient man, the kind who listened more than he spoke. He worked with his hands, repairing farm machinery across 3 counties, and no matter how long the day had been, he always came home with a smile that made the evening feel lighter. Together, we built a modest life. Nothing extraordinary. A small house, a vegetable garden, Sunday dinners with family whenever everyone could gather. In time, we welcomed children into our home. Then, years later, grandchildren. Life became wonderfully busy. There were scraped knees to bandage, birthday cakes to bake, school concerts to attend, the ordinary moments that quietly become life's greatest treasures. And yet, every autumn, without fail, that rainy evening from 1952 returned. Not every day, not even every week, just once or twice each year. Usually when the first cold rain arrived, or when I heard 3 gentle knocks at my own front door. Memory has curious habits. It chooses its own calendar. Thomas noticed it before I ever mentioned it. One October evening, many years after we were married, we sat together on the porch watching rain drift across the fields. "You've gone quiet," he said. I was remembering something. He waited, never rushing me. So I told him everything: the knock, the tea, the ride, the newspaper, the visit to Sheriff Collins. When I finished, he remained silent for a long while. Finally, he reached over and took my hand. "I wish you could see yourself the way I do." I looked at him. "You see one rainy night. I see a woman who refused to let fear decide who deserved kindness. His words settled gently into my heart. Still, the question never disappeared completely. Would I open the door again? I asked myself that question more times than I could ever count. Especially after our children were born, it seemed like an impossible choice. When we're young, kindness often feels simple. As we grow older, responsibility joins the conversation. I wondered whether becoming a mother would have changed my decision. If someone had knocked during another storm, would I have invited him inside, or would I have spoken through the closed door? I never found a perfect answer. Perhaps there isn't one. Every moment asks something different of us. Every circumstance carries its own quiet wisdom. One evening, when my oldest grandson was about 12, he asked me a question that caught me completely by surprise. "Grandma, have you ever met someone famous?" I laughed. "No." Then I thought for a moment. "At least, not the kind you're thinking of." He smiled, expecting a story. I almost told him. Almost. Instead, I simply said, "I once met someone I'll never forget." He accepted that answer without asking another question. Children have a remarkable gift. They know when a story isn't ready to be told. The years continued their gentle march forward. Neighbors came and went. Old friends grew older beside us. Some quietly left this world. New families moved into the valley. The little general store became larger. The dirt roads slowly turned into paved ones. Telephone lines stretched across fields that had once been empty. The world changed, faster than any of us expected. But one thing never changed. Whenever I saw a stranger sitting alone in a cafe, or walking beside a country road with tired eyes, I found myself wondering about the story they carried. Not because I expected danger, because I had learned that every face hides chapters we cannot read. Some are joyful, some heartbreaking. Most are far more complicated than they first appear. That lesson became one of the quiet foundations of my life. As the decades passed, I stopped asking whether I had made the right decision that rainy evening. Instead, I began asking a different question. What kind of person did I hope to remain? One ruled entirely by fear, or one guided by wisdom, tempered with compassion? I still believed in locking my doors at night. I still believed in being careful. Life had taught me that caution has its place, but I also believed something else. If fear becomes the only voice we listen to, it slowly begins to close doors that were never meant to stay shut. Not just the front door, the doors inside our hearts. Now, sitting here beside this old lamp at 95, I can finally see that memory from a greater distance, not as a single frightening event, but as one thread woven into the larger fabric of a long life. A life filled with far more kindness than fear, far more love than regret, and perhaps that is the part worth remembering most. There comes a time in every long life when the questions that once demanded answers begin asking something different of us. Not what happened, What have you learned? It took me many years to understand that those are not the same question. One searches for facts, the other searches for peace. And peace, I've discovered, is often much harder to find. The older I became, the less often I thought about the newspaper. The photograph slowly lost its sharp edges in my memory. Even the exact headline faded with time. But there were other things that refused to disappear. The sound of rain against the porch roof, the warmth of the teacup in his hands, the careful way he folded Father's towel before leaving, the quiet thank you he spoke as though it truly mattered. Those memories remained, not because they proved anything. They simply belonged to that evening, and memories, I've learned, should be allowed to remain whole, not broken apart by what came afterward. For a while, I made the mistake of believing that kindness had somehow betrayed me. It sounds strange to say those words aloud. How could kindness ever be at fault? Yet that is where my thoughts wandered during the first few years. If I had been less trusting, if I had been colder, if I had turned him away, perhaps I would never have carried the weight of that memory. It seemed like such a simple solution. Build a wall around the heart. Never wonder again. Never be surprised again. Never be disappointed again. But walls have curious habits. They keep danger out, yet they also keep warmth from getting in. One Sunday after church, an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker stopped me outside the chapel. She must have been nearly 80 then. To me, she seemed impossibly old. Now I smile at that thought. Age has a funny way of changing our measurements. She noticed I seemed distracted. You've been carrying something heavy. I nodded, without realizing it. I found myself telling her the story. Not every detail, only enough for her to understand why I questioned myself. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked across the churchyard where children were chasing one another beneath the maple trees. Then she said something I have never forgotten. Eleanor, if a candle once lit the path for someone who later chose darkness, would you blame the candle? I frowned slightly. No, why not? Because the candle only gave light. She smiled. Exactly. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. Perhaps deeper than anything else anyone had ever said about that memory. Kindness does not control another person's choices. It simply reveals our own. A warm meal cannot erase another person's mistakes, nor does it become a mistake itself. Compassion is not responsible for what follows after it has been offered honestly. That realization did not erase my sadness, but it quietly untied the knot of guilt I had carried for so long. From that day forward, whenever the memory returned, it arrived differently, less like a burden, more like an old photograph, one that deserved reflection rather than fear. I no longer searched it for hidden clues. I stopped asking whether I should have noticed something different. Instead, I remembered the lesson. Every human being carries chapters invisible to everyone else. Some are beautiful, some heartbreaking, some unfinished. We cannot read them simply by looking into someone's eyes. As the years passed, I found myself becoming a little more patient with people. The impatient cashier at the market, the tired young father struggling with two restless children, the elderly neighbor who seemed grumpy every morning, but quietly left vegetables on everyone's doorstep each autumn. Life had taught me not to hurry toward conclusions, because every story begins long before we arrive in it. We usually enter somewhere in the middle, never at the beginning, rarely at the end, and because of that, we almost never possess the whole truth. That thought made me slower to judge, quicker to listen, more willing to leave room for what I did not know. I believe that has made my life gentler, not easier, but gentler. There is a difference. Sometimes people ask me what wisdom comes with growing old. They expect something grand, some secret discovered after 95 years. I usually disappoint them, because the lessons worth keeping are rarely complicated. Boil the kettle before guests arrive. Say thank you often. Apologize while you still can. Sit outside after the rain. Watch sunsets whenever life allows. And never assume you know another person's entire story after only a few pages. That last lesson cost me many years to understand, yet I wouldn't trade it now. It taught me humility. The lamp beside my chair flickers gently every evening. Its light reaches only a small corner of the room, not the entire house. Certainly not the whole world. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps none of us are meant to illuminate everything, only the little space we've been entrusted to care for. A family, a friend, a stranger caught in the rain, one quiet evening at a time. Looking back now, I no longer remember that autumn because of the newspaper. I remember it because it changed the questions I carried through life. Instead of asking, can kindness ever be wasted? I began asking, what kind of heart do I hope to leave behind? That question has guided me far better than fear ever could. And strangely, it has also helped me sleep more peacefully, because some answers are not found by solving the past. They are found by choosing who we become tomorrow. There is an old oil lamp beside my chair. It isn't the same one that stood in the farmhouse kitchen all those years ago. That lamp was eventually worn beyond repair. Its glass chimney cracked one cold winter. Its brass base grew too fragile to mend. But before it was discarded, Thomas carefully removed the little turning key that controlled the flame. He polished it until it shone. Then he placed it inside a small wooden box. I thought you might like to keep this, he said. I asked him why. He smiled in that quiet way of his, because some lights deserve to be remembered. The key is still in that little box. Sometimes my grandchildren ask why I keep such an ordinary piece of metal. I simply tell them, it belonged to a lamp that watched over many beautiful evenings. That answer has always been enough. Not every story needs to be told all at once. Some become gentler if they are allowed to ripen with time. People often imagine that growing old means remembering everything,